Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labor is supporting the Land Transport Speed Limits Validation and Other Matters Bill at this first reading. And I think, sir, there's nobody in this House who likes the idea of voting for retrospective legislation. It is undesirable, but in this case, we believe that this is a necessary bill, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why that's the case. The Minister has given us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of how this situation arose, and the basic facts, I think, are these: that under the Local Government Act 2002, councils are given the powers to set local speed limits and in built-up areas and outside schools and so on. And along with that power, councils were required to validate, or to review those bylaws. And I think was, if my memory serves me correctly, that the bylaws must be reviewed after 5 years and then every 10 years thereafter. And what has happened in this case is that the Kapiti District Council discovered, that Kapiti Coast District Council discovered in May this year that their speed limit bylaw had been inadvertently revoked in 2012. And that's obviously led to quite a bit of scurrying around by officials looking at how this happened. And it appears, we're advised, that there are a significant number of other councils who may find themselves in a similar situation. The upshot of all this is that there are, it seems, tens of thousands. I don't think it's known exactly how many, but there could be tens of thousands of speeding infringements that are technically invalid because of the failure of an unknown number of councils to follow the prescribed rules set down in the Local Government Act 2002. So that puts the government in a very tricky position, and there are a whole lot of consequences that have to be considered as a result of that. Our view is that while retrospective legislation is undesirable, mistakes do happen, and this is a pretty good example of mistakes happening on a fairly large scale. It's necessary, we believe, for reasons of public safety, for reasons of public confidence in our road safety system, which speed limits are obviously an essential part, and for fiscal and other practical reasons. It's important that these mistakes are put right, and that the laws and the speed limits that everybody has assumed have been in place over these years, and all of the infringements that were issued under these laws, that they are not overturned, because that, I believe, sir, would be untenable. It would be untenable for the communities who are protected by our road safety system and by speed limits. It would be untenable, I think, for thousands of New Zealanders who committed speeding infringements that they and everybody else assumed were valid. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the detail. The background to this is that there is the Land Transport Rule 2003, otherwise known as the Speed Limits Rule, basically sets a default 100 km/h speed limit for all roads unless this has been reduced by the relevant authority like the council. And then under that, local councils all around the country have the power to set local speed limits, and I think that's as it should be. It's an entirely appropriate thing for local communities to have that power. But the Local Government Act 2002 does require that the bylaws setting those speed limits are reviewed, first after 5 years and then every 10 years after that. Now, the solution that this bill brings to the House is that what it does is sets out to validate speed limits that have been created since 2004, regardless of whether they were promulgated under potentially invalid bylaws. and I'll repeat, as far as I've been advised, it's unclear about the scale, the possible scale of this problem. I think we know with certainty that Kapiti District Council have put their hand up and said that's the case, but there may well be potentially quite a large number of others. It also validates enforcement actions that have been carried out in relation to those bylaws since 2004. What it does is the bill removes any ambiguity, or it attempts to clarify the very clear the powers in the Land Transport Act 1998 for road controlling authorities like the councils to make a speed limit by law, and then it clarifies the procedural requirements for those authorities around that power to make bylaws. And my understanding of the bill, I haven't had a chance to go through the bill in detail yet, but my understanding is that while it leaves those powers and those responsibilities with the councils, it removes the requirement to review them every 5 years and 10 years, which is the thing that's got councils into this mess in the first place. What's the case for urgency? Why should this legislation be pushed through all stages this afternoon? And let me just touch on those. There's clearly a risk to road safety, to the safety of communities throughout the country, if there's any kind of confusion or perception that the speed limits that everyone has thought are in place are suddenly thought that they don't apply or are unenforceable. Where the New Zealand Police have enforced invalid speed limits over the last few years, that obviously sets off a whole chain of consequences: demerit points, fines, other sanctions, licences lost, and so on. If this bill was not passed with urgency, the people who experience those sanctions could then argue that they've illegally or unlawfully suffered the consequences, and I think that would create a situation of real confusion, including significant financial risk to the government if all of those infringements and the penalties that followed from them were called into question. Not to mention, Mr. Speaker, the possibility of individuals seeking compensation for loss of employment, disqualification, or even in some cases imprisonment. And the fourth point that I would raise is that it would put our police force, who are out there every day on the roads around New Zealand trying to keep the roads safe, protecting people, enforcing the speed limits, it would put the police in a very, very invidious position. It would undermine confidence in the police, but also the entire road safety system. I want to make the point that while again I think none of us feel great about passing retrospective legislation, the Legislation Advisory Committee has noted that this retrospective legislation can be justified in some circumstances, and it quotes, for example, bills to validate matters that were generally understood and intended to be lawful but were in fact unlawful as a result of a technical error, or secondly, to address a matter that is essential to public safety. And I think it's fair to say that this bill ticks both of those boxes and the guidelines that are set out by the Legislation Advisory Committee. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to leave it there. We're going to have more time to discuss the bill, including the committee stages, where we'll be able to hopefully tease out more detail about this bill. Thank you.
Jonathan Young.
Thank you, sir.